Shackleton's chilling voyage details the misfortunate events that befall him in his quest to head the first expedition across the entirety of the South Pole. In 1914, Shackleton and his crew of 27 men, 34 dogs, and one cat by the name of Mr. Chippy set out, hoping to gain glory and knowledge from the expedition. They departed from a port in British waters in their ship, the Endurance. The Endurance was one of the best ice-breaking ships in its class. However, it was destined to sink in the harsh waters of the Arctic not 1 year later, leaving 28 men left to fend for themselves in one of the most inhospitable climates in the world. This is the story of Shackleton and his crew on the ill-fated voyage of the Endurance. There were four large expeditions prior to Shackleton's disastrous voyage, two of which Shackleton partook in. The first was the Discovery Expedition, lasting from 1901 to 1904. The main participants in this expedition were Robert Falcon Scott, an officer in the British Navy, and a young Ernest Shackleton. After all of the members of their party succumbed to scurvy, they turned back, only 460 miles from the South Pole. Despite their failure, the public idolized them as heroes. Years later, Shackleton made his own attempt in the Nimrod expedition, but was forced to turn back not 60 miles from the pole. A Scandinavian named Roland Amundsen made it to the North Pole first, winning the unofficial race between nations. Due to their use of dogs and experience in cold weather, combined with their proficiency in skiing, all five men returned alive and healthy. Amundsen's success was celebrated worldwide, and he received personal telegrams of congratulations from U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt and King George V of England. Robert and his team reached the South Pole on the 17th of January, 1912. Less than 5 weeks after Roland Amundsen's Norwegian expedition. This expedition ended with Robert Falcon Scott and his crew dying upon their return from the pole. Their bodies were found in their tent, and with the use of his journal, they were able to find out what happened to him and his men. Alongside his journal, they found fossils of an ancient tree that proved at one point in time Antarctica used to be forested and jointed with other continents. This discovery reinvigorated England's interest in the South Pole and in many ways assisted in Shackleton securing funding for his expedition. Shackleton loved adventure from a young age, and at the age of 16 left boarding school to join the Navy with hopes of discovering new lands. Shackleton knew it was possible for the English to make it to the South Pole, noting that many of the prior missions, including his own Nimrod expedition, failed due to inadequate equipment and undertrained men. Knowing these problems, Shackleton set about acquiring funding for a new mission in which he would not make the same mistakes. Shackleton received many donations over the course of his campaigning, the largest of which coming from the British government to the amount of £100,000 or $10 million in today's money. His largest private donation, however, came from Sir James Caird to the amount of £24,000 or $2.4 million in today's money. Having finally secured funding for his expedition and a crew to man his top-of-the-line icebreaker known as the Endurance and its sister ship the Aurora, which would pick them up once they had reached the other side of Antarctica. On August 8th, the Endurance sailed for the Antarctic via Buenos Aires and the sub-Antarctic island of South Georgia, where they would set off from a Norwegian whaling station. Once World War I began, Shackleton immediately asked the British government if they required their participation in the war, seeing as they had a good ship with 13 capable crew members. Shackleton received a reply from the Admiralty with a single word: proceed. For all the crew of the Endurance knew, the war would only last for a few months. The Endurance left with a deckload of coal, in addition to normal stores, to help with the extra load on the engines when it came to pushing through the pack ice in the Weddell Sea. Extra clothing and stores were taken from South Georgia in the event the Endurance would be trapped in ice in the Weddell Sea as it froze. The Endurance went through 1,000 miles of pack ice over a 6-week period. They were 1 day away from their destination before they got trapped in the ice. By the end of February, temperatures had fallen and were regularly -20 Celsius. This caused the ice to expand around and through the hull of the Endurance, fully immobilizing it, and due to the immense cold, leaving the men aboard helpless. The Endurance had drifted at least 1,186 miles since first becoming fast in the ice, 281 days previously. She was 346 miles from the Paulet Island, the nearest point where there was any possibility of finding food and shelter. Eventually, the pack ice shifted, crushing the Endurance, by the end of November forcing them out on the ice. The men went out to look for fresh meat for the dogs themselves in the form of seals and penguins. December 22nd, 1915, all remaining luxuries were eaten. The last good meal the men would have for the next 8 months. On December 23rd, 1915, the men's temporary ocean camp was abandoned as they attempted to move westward to Paulet Island and a substantial food depot. With them, they brought 3 lifeboats, leaving the motorized raft due to wait. On December 29th, 1915, the untraversable ice was met and the new camp was established, Patience Camp. They were to live on the floe for nearly 3.5 months, waiting for conditions to change. April 9th, 1916, the ice began to break up and clear the water. Shackleton and his crew attempted to sail to the South Shetland Islands in their 3 lifeboats. From the South Shetland Islands, they went to Elephant Island was full of penguins, allowing the men who had sustained themselves off of scarce rations and dog meat since they had run out of food the prior Christmas, variation in their diet, along with a more assured food source. Here, they created shacks out of 2 of the lifeboats, flipping them over and piling rocks beneath them to form a makeshift hut. In these huts, the only doctor aboard treated the wounded. Knowing that this would not be a permanent situation, Shackleton and 5 of his men decided to gamble with their lives by sailing to the nearest closest island. Ironically, the island they first departed from, South Georgia Island, was only 800 miles away, and the only thing they were able to make the journey in was a lifeboat. If they missed, they would have to go on for thousands of miles to Africa, assuring their deaths. However, they were willing to take this risk for their crew and set about preparations for the treacherous journey. Once preparations had been made, the 6 men gathered on a makeshift sailboat and began their expedition to South Georgia Island. Along the way, they hit a storm and nearly capsized. However, they made it to South Georgia Island and made camp in a cave. Once they had properly assessed their situation, the 6 men decided to leave 3 at the camp, moving to come back for them once the other 3 had reached the whaling station. Shackleton and 2 of his men began the treacherous journey across South Georgia Island, having to go through mountains and waterfalls to make it to the whaling station. In just 2 days, Shackleton and 2 of his men had made it across the island to the South Whaling Station, where he asked the leader of the station if the war was over and who won, where the man responded, "The war is not over." Sadly, even after all the horrors they endured, due to the horrendous nature of the Great War, the populace was jaded and the age of exploration was over, giving little credit to the harrowing journey of the 28 men who had survived the impossible, with not one of them dying. After 18 months of fighting through cold, hunger, and disease, the men had made it and all survived. Despite his failure, he was still an inspiration to future generations of explorers. Their journey a testament to humanity's perseverance in times of adversity, a shining example of what humans can do when faced with impossible odds.